The whispers cut through the air like knives as Elizabeth Hensley stepped off the train at Willow Creek Station. The spring of 1897 brought more than just wildflowers to this small western town, it delivered a spectacle none would soon forget. Look at her, wearing a wedding dress right off the train. Who does she think she's fooling? My word, she's a tall one, isn't she? Elizabeth clutched her worn carpetbag tighter, her knuckles whitening as she scanned the crowd for a face that matched the photograph in her pocket. The man who had promised to meet her, who had written such beautiful letters about building a life together, was nowhere to be found. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as one by one, the townspeople dispersed, their entertainment concluded. Their laughter lingered in the air, hanging around Elizabeth like a shroud. Still, she stood tall, her shoulders squared despite the weight of their judgment. Have you ever felt completely alone in a crowd? Have you ever had all eyes on you for all the wrong reasons? If you have, hit that like button and subscribe, because Elizabeth's story of courage in the face of humiliation is one you won't want to miss. The station master approached, his face a mixture of pity and discomfort. Miss, the last wagon into town left an hour ago. I'm closing up now. Elizabeth nodded, reality crashing down around her. She had traveled over 1,000 miles, spent her last dollar, and now stood abandoned in a strange town, wearing a wedding dress that suddenly felt like a costume in a cruel play. Life in St. Louis had never been kind to Elizabeth. Born with a strength and stature that made other women seem fragile in comparison, she'd spent years hearing she was too much, too tall, too strong, too outspoken. The crowded tenements where she worked as a seamstress were filled with whispers about the woman who could lift as much as any man but couldn't seem to catch a husband's eye. You'll die an old maid, her landlady had warned. A woman like you needs to find someone who values strength over beauty. Those words had stung, but they'd also pushed Elizabeth toward the newspaper advertisement that changed everything: hardworking farmer seeks bride. Must be strong, capable, unafraid of rural life. Beauty less important than character. The letters that followed had given Elizabeth hope. James Miller had seemed to understand her, to value precisely what others mocked. He wrote of his small farm, his dreams of expansion, his desire for a partner rather than a porcelain doll. So Elizabeth had sewn herself a simple wedding dress, packed her meager belongings, and boarded a train west, toward promise, toward acceptance, toward a new beginning. Now, as the station master locked the door behind him, that hope withered like flowers in frost. Miss? Are you waiting for someone? The voice startled Elizabeth from her thoughts. She turned to find a man watching her with curious eyes, not mocking, not pitying, but genuinely concerned. He stood tall in polished boots and a well-tailored vest, his hat tipped at an angle that suggested confidence without arrogance. Elizabeth admitted, pride warring with desperation. But it seems plans have changed. The man's gaze flicked to her wedding dress, then back to her face. Understanding dawned in his eyes, green as new leaves and just as full of life. Everett Callahan, he said, extending his hand. My family owns Callahan Ranch north of town. Elizabeth hesitated before accepting his handshake. His grip was firm, respectful, treating her strength as natural rather than shocking. Elizabeth Hensley, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Miss Hensley, I don't mean to presume, but you appear to need assistance. My ranch has plenty of room, and my mother and sister would ensure all propriety is maintained. The offer hung between them as the last rays of sunlight painted the platform gold. Elizabeth weighed her options, which were, in truth, non-existent. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I would be grateful for temporary lodging while I reconsider my situation. Everett nodded, lifting her carpetbag despite her protest that she could carry it herself. Sometimes accepting help is its own kind of strength, Miss Hensley. Callahan Ranch emerged from the twilight like something from a storybook, sprawling pastures enclosed by white fences, a large barn with fresh paint, and atop a gentle rise, a two-story house with wide porches and warm light spilling from every window. Elizabeth felt her breath catch. This was no struggling farm but a thriving enterprise. As Everett's wagon approached, she straightened her back, determined not to appear as overwhelmed as she felt. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, the same green as Everett's but lacking their warmth, assessed Elizabeth with undisguised suspicion. "Mother, this is Miss Elizabeth Hensley," Everett said, helping Elizabeth down from the wagon. "She needs lodging for a few days." Eleanor Callahan's gaze lingered on Elizabeth's wedding dress. "I see. And why, may I ask, are you dressed for a wedding with no groom in sight?" Before Elizabeth could answer, a younger woman appeared in the doorway, perhaps 20, with Everett's coloring but softer features. "Mother, let her at least come inside before the interrogation," she said, offering Elizabeth a curious smile. "I'm Lila Callahan. You must be exhausted." Inside, the house was as impressive as its exterior: polished wood, quality furnishings, and the unmistakable air of old money. The servants cast sidelong glances at Elizabeth as she followed Lila upstairs to a guest room. "You'll have to excuse Mother," Lila whispered. "She's protective of Everett. Half the women in the county have tried to trap him into marriage." That night, through the thin walls, Elizabeth heard the heated discussion downstairs. "A mail-order bride? In our home? What will people say?" "They'll say we showed Christian charity, Mother. Or they'll say you've lost your mind, bringing home strays." Elizabeth pressed her face into the pillow, determined not to let them hear her cry. Morning found Elizabeth in the garden, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. She had changed into her one spare dress, plain brown wool that matched her practical nature far better than yesterday's wedding gown. "You're an early riser." She turned to find Everett approaching, 2 steaming cups in his hands. He offered one to her, coffee, strong and black. "On a farm, the day begins before dawn," she said, accepting the cup. "I should thank you for your kindness, Mr. Callahan, but I'll be leaving today. Perhaps there's work in town." "I have a proposition," Everett interrupted, his expression serious. "Not charity, but a potential solution for us both." Elizabeth waited, wary but curious. "My ranch needs someone with your strength and determination. I need a partner, not an ornament. And you need a fresh start." He took a deep breath. "I propose marriage, Miss Hensley." Coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup. "Mr. Callahan, we barely know each other." "True," he acknowledged. "But I know enough. I've watched you face humiliation with dignity. I've seen your practical nature, your resilience. These qualities matter more than years of acquaintance." "And what would your mother say?" Elizabeth challenged. A smile tugged at his lips. "She'll adapt. The question is, will you consider it? Not romance, perhaps, but a partnership based on mutual respect and common goals." Elizabeth studied him, searching for deceit and finding none. "Why would you do this?" "Because sometimes the unexpected choice is the right one," he said simply. "And because I believe we could build something worthwhile together." The proposition hung between them, impossible yet tempting. A chance to stay, to prove herself, to build a life on her own terms. "I'll need time to consider," she finally said. Everett nodded. "Of course. But not too much time, the town already has enough to gossip about." By noon, all of Willow Creek buzzed with the news. Elizabeth felt their stares as she walked beside Everett through the general store, selecting practical items to replace what she'd left behind. "That's her, the mail-order bride nobody wanted. Poor Everett Callahan, always picking up broken things. I heard she bewitched him somehow. Eleanor must be beside herself." Everett's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply placing a protective hand at Elizabeth's elbow as they navigated the crowded aisles. At the counter, the shopkeeper's wife made no effort to lower her voice. "Everett Callahan, have you lost your senses? This woman shows up in a wedding dress, gets abandoned by her intended, and you bring her home like a stray cat?" Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Everett replied calmly, "Mrs. Porter, I'd appreciate if you'd address Miss Hensley directly with any questions about her character. And I'd remind you that Christian charity begins with kindness, not judgment." The woman flushed, muttering apologies as she wrapped their purchases. Outside, Elizabeth stopped in the shadow of an oak tree. "This is what it will always be like, isn't it? The whispers, the judgment." At first, Everett admitted. But people tire of old gossip when new scandals emerge. And actions speak louder than rumors. Elizabeth watched a group of women across the street, their heads bent together as they cast glances her way. Have you ever been judged unfairly, before anyone took the time to know you? Comment below if you've faced prejudice based on appearances or circumstances beyond your control. I've made my decision, Elizabeth said suddenly. Yes, I'll marry you, Mr. Callahan. Not for rescue, but for partnership. Everett's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then let's give them something real to talk about. Their wedding was small and swift, just family, a preacher, and vows exchanged in the Callahan living room. Elizabeth wore her brown wool dress rather than the white gown that now symbolized false promises. Life as Mrs. Callahan began immediately and mercilessly. Eleanor, determined to prove Elizabeth unworthy, assigned her the most difficult household tasks while criticizing her every move. The linens must be pressed twice, Elizabeth. Surely even in St. Louis they taught proper laundering. That stew is far too bland. The Callahan men expect flavor in their meals. A lady doesn't carry firewood herself. She summons a servant. Elizabeth bit her tongue and completed each task perfectly, only to find new, more difficult challenges awaiting. The servants, taking cues from Eleanor, forgot to inform Elizabeth of meal times, misplaced her few belongings, and whispered just loudly enough for her to hear. The ranch hands were no better. They left gates open so she'd have to chase escaped livestock, hid tools she needed, and once, accidentally, let a bull into the chicken yard she was tending. The worst came 3 weeks after the wedding. Elizabeth was hanging laundry when she smelled smoke. Turning, she saw flames licking at the barn door, small yet, but growing quickly. "Fire!" she shouted, dropping her basket and running toward the well. No one came. The ranch hands were in distant fields, Everett was in town, and the house was too far for anyone to hear. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She drew bucket after bucket, her arms straining as she fought the growing blaze alone. Sweat soaked her dress, soot blackened her face, but she worked methodically until the last ember died. Only then did she notice Eleanor watching from the porch, her expression unreadable. "You could have helped," Elizabeth said, too exhausted for politeness. "I could have," Eleanor agreed. "But then I wouldn't have seen what you're made of." That night, Everett found Elizabeth soaking her blistered hands. His fury at learning about the fire was matched only by his pride in her quick action. "You saved this ranch today," he said softly. "No matter what Mother says, you've proven yourself 10 times over." Elizabeth looked up, surprised to find his eyes shining with something beyond gratitude, something that made her heart beat faster despite her exhaustion. As spring melted into summer, Elizabeth found her rhythm. She rose before dawn, worked alongside the ranch hands, and slowly earned their respect through sheer determination and capability. "Mrs. Callahan, could you show me that knot again?" asked young Tommy, the newest hire, watching in awe as Elizabeth's strong fingers deftly secured a fence post. Like this, she demonstrated, her once soft hands now calloused and confident. "The secret is tension, too tight and it breaks, too loose and it fails when needed most." The older hands, who had once sabotaged her work, now sought her advice on everything from treating horse ailments to predicting weather from cloud patterns, knowledge she'd gleaned from books devoured during her few quiet moments. Elizabeth developed systems that improved efficiency, reorganizing the tool shed, creating a rotation for livestock grazing, implementing a new method for preserving vegetables that reduced spoilage. Each innovation was met with initial resistance, then grudging acceptance, and finally appreciation. Even the house staff began to thaw, especially after Elizabeth defended a young maid accused of breaking Eleanor's prized vase. "I broke it," Elizabeth had said firmly, though they all knew she'd been nowhere near the parlor that day. "Dock it from my personal allowance." Later, the grateful maid had whispered, "Why would you do that for me, ma'am?" Elizabeth's answer was simple, because everyone deserves a second chance. By midsummer, Elizabeth had carved out her place, not as the delicate lady of the house Eleanor had envisioned for her son, but as something far more valuable, a true partner in the ranch's success. The evenings became Elizabeth and Everett's sanctuary. After dinner, while Eleanor retired to her sitting room and Lila practiced piano, they would slip onto the west porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I never thought marriage would be like this," Elizabeth admitted one evening, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. Everett's hand found hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Like what?" "Like friendship," she said. "In St. Louis, marriages seemed like business arrangements or power struggles. Never this, partnership." He smiled, the fading light catching the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Is that all it is to you? A partnership?" Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer air. Their marriage had begun as convenience, but somewhere between fighting fires and mending fences, something had shifted. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore." Everett leaned closer, his voice dropping. "When I saw you on that platform, something told me you were extraordinary. Every day since has proven me right." Their first kiss tasted of promise, not the false hope of her journey to Willow Creek, but something real, built on shared struggle and mutual respect. Later, as stars emerged above the ranch, they talked of dreams, expanding the cattle operation, adding orchards to the eastern slopes, building a school for the children of ranch workers. "We could do it all," Everett said, his enthusiasm infectious. "Together, we could make Callahan Ranch the finest in the territory." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "Together." Eleanor Callahan was not a woman who surrendered easily. As Elizabeth's position strengthened, Eleanor's tactics grew more desperate. "She's turned my son against me," Eleanor complained to Margaret Porter over tea. "He consults her on business matters now, a woman who arrived in a borrowed wedding dress with nothing but a carpetbag." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "The whole town is talking. Such a shame to see Everett bewitched by an outsider." But gossip wasn't enough. Eleanor needed action. Her opportunity came in the form of James Blackwood, owner of the neighboring ranch and a widower of considerable means. Eleanor invited him for dinner, seated him beside Lila, and made sure Elizabeth served undercooked beef and overly salted potatoes. "My daughter-in-law is still learning proper cooking," Eleanor apologized, ignoring the fact that Elizabeth had prepared neither dish. "Perhaps you could advise her, Mr. Blackwood. I understand your late wife was an exceptional hostess." Elizabeth maintained her dignity, even as Blackwood lectured her on proper meal preparation. Later, she overheard Eleanor in Everett's study. "James Blackwood has expressed interest in a partnership," Eleanor was saying. "He's willing to invest considerably in expanding our operation." "We don't need outside investment," Everett replied. "Elizabeth and I have plans." "Plans from a woman who knows nothing of ranching tradition." "James has offered $5,000. Think what we could do with that." What Eleanor didn't say, what Elizabeth discovered only later, was that Blackwood's offer came with conditions. Everett would manage both properties, spending most of his time at Blackwood Ranch, while Eleanor would resume control of the Callahan household. The scheme might have worked, had Elizabeth not found Eleanor and Blackwood in the study late one night, money changing hands as they discussed how to separate Everett from his unfortunate choice of wife. Elizabeth didn't confront them. Instead, she did what she'd always done, worked harder, proved her worth, and trusted that action spoke louder than schemes. The annual Harvest Festival arrived with autumn's first chill. For Willow Creek, this was more than celebration, it was tradition, competition, and social hierarchy all rolled into one weekend of exhibitions, contests, and dances. "You should enter the pie contest," Lila suggested one morning as Elizabeth kneaded bread. Their relationship had evolved from wary politeness to genuine friendship, especially after Elizabeth taught Lila to ride astride rather than side-saddle. Elizabeth laughed. "Your mother has won that contest for 15 years. She'd never forgive me for competing." "Exactly why you should," Lila said, eyes twinkling. "Besides, your apple pie is better than hers. Everyone knows it but no one dares say it." The festival transformed the town square into a riot of color and activity. Farmers displayed prize livestock, craftsmen sold wares, and the women of Willow Creek presented their finest domestic achievements for judgment. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, her hair braided and pinned in a coronet that emphasized her strong features. She carried her pie, made with apples from the wild orchard beyond the north pasture, spiced with cinnamon and a secret ingredient she'd discovered by accident. The whispers followed her across the square. "Bold of her to enter Eleanor's contest. That dress is almost becoming. Still, she's no beauty. Everett looks proud enough for both of them." Indeed, Everett walked beside her, his hand at the small of her back, his expression daring anyone to speak against his wife. The judging tent fell silent as Elizabeth placed her entry beside 14 others, including Eleanor's perfectly latticed masterpiece. The three judges, the mayor's wife, the preacher, and the elderly owner of the general store, moved methodically from pie to pie, tasting, discussing, making notes. When they reached Elizabeth's contribution, Mrs. Mayer's eyebrows rose in surprise. She whispered something to the preacher, who nodded and took a second bite. The wait seemed eternal. Elizabeth stood tall, her hands clasped before her, ignoring the speculative glances and Eleanor's confident smile. Finally, the mayor's wife stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have our winner." She paused dramatically. Mrs. Elizabeth Callahan, for her spiced apple pie with honey crust. If you've ever overcome the odds to achieve something no one thought possible, hit that subscribe button now. Elizabeth's journey is just reaching its turning point, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Silence fell over the tent like a heavy blanket. Elizabeth stood frozen, certain she'd misheard. Eleanor's face drained of color, her knuckles whitening around her handbag. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Lila, her young face alight with triumph, applauded with enthusiastic abandon. Beside her, Everett joined in, his proud smile visible to all. Slowly, others followed, first the ranch hands who had witnessed Elizabeth's daily dedication, then the shopkeepers who had come to respect her practical nature and fair dealings, and finally, reluctantly, even those who had been her harshest critics. As Elizabeth accepted the blue ribbon, she caught Eleanor's eye across the tent. The older woman gave a stiff nod, not congratulations, exactly, but acknowledgement. It was, perhaps, the most Elizabeth could hope for. The victory transformed more than just a baking contest. As Elizabeth and Everett moved through the festival that day, people who had once avoided her now approached with congratulations and conversation. Women who had whispered behind fans now invited her to join their quilting circle. Men who had dismissed her as Everett's charity case now asked her opinion on cattle prices and weather predictions. "You've won them over," Everett murmured as they watched the sunset from the festival grounds, the sounds of fiddles tuning up for the evening dance floating on the autumn air. "Not all of them," Elizabeth replied, nodding toward Eleanor, who sat rigidly among the town matrons, pointedly ignoring their direction. "Mother will come around," Everett said, though doubt tinged his voice. "She respects strength, even when it challenges her." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I didn't come to Willow Creek for your mother's approval. I came for a chance to build something meaningful." As Everett led her onto the dance floor, her first public dance since arriving in town, Elizabeth realized that's exactly what she'd done. Not just a marriage or a place in the community, but a life defined by her own choices rather than others' expectations. Winter brought heavy snows and unexpected opportunities. When influenza swept through Willow Creek, Elizabeth organized the ranch women to deliver food and medicine to affected families. When the church roof collapsed under heavy snow, she worked alongside the men to repair it, her strength an asset rather than an oddity. "Mrs. Callahan, would you help with the Christmas pageant?" asked Mrs. Porter, the same woman who had once called her a stray cat. "The children respond so well to you." "Mrs. Callahan, might you share your preserving technique at our next homemakers meeting?" inquired the mayor's wife. "Your methods seem far more efficient than what we've been doing." Each request represented more than just tasks, they were invitations into the heart of community life, acknowledgments that Elizabeth belonged. The church social in February marked her complete acceptance. As she arranged cookies on platters, women who had once avoided her now sought her company, sharing recipes and town news as if she'd always been one of them. "You've changed this town," Reverend Thomas told her, watching as Elizabeth organized games for the children. "Your resilience has taught us all something about judging too quickly." Elizabeth smiled, watching Everett across the room as he chatted with farmers about spring planting. "The town has changed me too, Reverend. I came here looking for acceptance but found something more valuable, the courage to be myself regardless of acceptance." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "That's a sermon worth preaching, Mrs. Callahan. Perhaps you'll let me borrow the idea next Sunday." As Elizabeth moved through the social hall, she caught sight of Eleanor watching her from a corner. For once, the older woman's expression held something besides disapproval, perhaps curiosity, perhaps reassessment. Elizabeth nodded in her direction, an acknowledgement without submission. Their battle wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted. The confrontation Elizabeth had long anticipated came on a March morning as she kneaded bread in the kitchen. Eleanor entered silently, watching Elizabeth's strong hands work the dough with practiced efficiency. "You've changed the recipe," Eleanor observed, her tone neutral rather than accusatory. Elizabeth nodded. "Added honey and a bit of cornmeal. It keeps fresh longer." Eleanor moved closer, examining the dough. "My mother taught me to make bread when I was 8 years old. She said a woman's worth was measured by her bread and her children." "And what do you believe?" Elizabeth asked, continuing her work. Eleanor's sigh held the weight of decades. "I believed her, until a woman with no training produced better bread and earned my son's devotion without giving him children." Elizabeth's hands stilled. This was the closest Eleanor had come to acknowledging her worth. "I didn't come here to take Everett from you," Elizabeth said quietly. "I came for a fresh start. Everything else, including falling in love with your son, was unexpected." "Love?" Eleanor's eyebrow arched. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes," Elizabeth met her gaze steadily. "Though it began as partnership, it's grown into love. Not the kind in novels, perhaps, but something stronger, built on respect and shared purpose." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the flour dusting the table. "When my husband died, I thought I had to protect Everett from making poor choices. I never considered that his choices might be wiser than mine." It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall Eleanor had built between them. "Would you like to learn my bread recipe?" Elizabeth offered. "In exchange, perhaps you could teach me about the rose garden. I've never had much luck with flowers." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "I suppose we could both learn something new." That afternoon, they worked side by side in the kitchen, their truce fragile but real. The battle wasn't over, Eleanor was too proud, Elizabeth too independent for complete harmony, but they had found common ground in their love for Everett and their commitment to the ranch's success. Spring brought new growth to more than just the land. Lila, inspired by Elizabeth's example, began to question the path that had been laid out for her since birth. "I don't want to marry just to secure a good match," she announced at Sunday dinner, as Eleanor discussed potential suitors. "I want what Elizabeth and Everett have, partnership, respect, shared purpose." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "That's different." Your brother needed a practical wife to help with the ranch. And I need a practical husband who will support my ambitions, Lila countered. I want to study medicine. Dr. Harrison has offered to mentor me. The ensuing argument might have escalated had Elizabeth not intervened. Lila has a gift for healing, she said calmly. You've seen how she nursed the Wilsons' children through scarlet fever. Why waste that talent? Because it's not proper. Eleanor exclaimed. A Callahan woman becoming a doctor. What would people say? They said a mail-order bride couldn't become a respected rancher's wife, Elizabeth pointed out. Yet here we are. Everett, who had been watching the exchange with interest, finally spoke. Mother, times are changing. Lila deserves the chance to use her gifts, just as Elizabeth has. Later, as Lila hugged Elizabeth in gratitude, the younger woman whispered, You showed me it's possible to define yourself beyond others' expectations. I'll never forget that. Elizabeth watched Lila walk away, her steps lighter than before. This, perhaps, was her greatest victory, not winning over the town or earning Eleanor's respect, but showing another woman that strength could take many forms. 1 year after her arrival in Willow Creek, Elizabeth stood before the mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back. Gone was the desperate mail-order bride in an ill-fitting wedding dress. In her place stood a woman whose strength showed in every line of her body, whose confidence needed no external validation. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, now bore calluses from ranch labor. Her skin had darkened from days in the sun, her frame had grown even stronger from physical work. But the most profound changes were invisible, the certainty in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the absence of apology in her posture. What are you thinking? Everett asked, entering the room and wrapping his arms around her waist. Elizabeth leaned back against him, their eyes meeting in the mirror. I'm thinking about the woman who stepped off that train a year ago, so desperate to be accepted that she would have changed everything about herself to fit in. And now? Now I know that acceptance means nothing if you have to become someone else to earn it. She turned in his arms, facing him directly. I'm grateful for your rescue that day, but more grateful that you never tried to change me. Everett's smile was tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Change you? That would be like painting over a masterpiece. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Elizabeth whispered the news she'd been saving, their family would grow by one come winter. Everett's joy was boundless, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach as he made plans for their child's future. Boy or girl, they'll know their mother's strength, he promised. They'll learn that true worth comes from character, not convention. Elizabeth fell asleep with those words echoing in her mind, a peace settling over her that she'd never known before. She had come to Willow Creek seeking acceptance but had found something far more precious, the freedom to define herself on her own terms. The afternoon train whistled its arrival, just as it had a year before. But this time, Elizabeth stood on the platform as a welcoming committee rather than an unwanted arrival. Beside her, Lila bounced with excitement, eager to greet the new doctor coming to mentor her. Do you think he'll be surprised to find his student is a woman? Lila asked, adjusting her hat for the third time. Elizabeth smiled. If he is, he'll recover quickly once he sees your determination. The train hissed to a stop, passengers disembarking into the spring sunshine. Among them was a young woman clutching a medical bag, looking around uncertainly. Dr. Rebecca Collins. Elizabeth approached, extending her hand. Welcome to Willow Creek. The relief on the young doctor's face was palpable. Mrs. Callahan. Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure what reception to expect in a town this size. A year ago, I might have shared your concerns, Elizabeth admitted as they walked toward the waiting wagon. But Willow Creek has a way of surprising you. As they passed through town, shopkeepers waved, children called greetings, and even Mrs. Porter emerged from her store to welcome the new doctor. You're something of a legend, Dr. Collins commented quietly. The station master told me how you arrived and transformed not just your circumstances but the town itself. Elizabeth laughed. Legends tend to grow with telling. The truth is simpler, I refuse to be defined by others' expectations. At the ranch, Eleanor waited on the porch, her initial resistance to a female doctor having given way to practical acceptance. "Dr. Collins, we've prepared the old foreman's cabin as your residence. I trust you'll find it suitable." It was as close to warmth as Eleanor got with strangers, but the fact that she'd personally overseen the cabin's preparation spoke volumes about her evolution. Later, as Elizabeth showed Dr. Collins around the property, the young woman asked, "How did you do it? Change so many minds?" Elizabeth considered the question as they watched ranch hands bringing in cattle for spring branding. "I didn't try to change minds. I simply lived authentically and let actions speak louder than prejudice." As twilight painted the western sky in shades of gold and purple, Elizabeth and Everett sat on the porch of their new home, a cabin they'd built on the eastern edge of Callahan land. Though smaller than the main house, it was theirs in every way that mattered, filled with furniture Everett had crafted and curtains Elizabeth had sewn. Elizabeth's hand rested on her growing belly as she watched the first stars appear. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd be when you found me on that platform?" Everett's laugh was warm in the gathering darkness. "I knew you were extraordinary from the first moment. But even I couldn't have predicted how completely you'd transform our lives." The transformation extended beyond their marriage. Under Elizabeth's influence, Callahan Ranch had expanded its operations, improved efficiency, and become known throughout the territory for innovation. Eleanor had gradually ceded control, finding new purpose in mentoring young ranch wives. Lila was thriving under Dr. Collins's tutelage, her future bright with possibility. And Willow Creek itself had changed, becoming more accepting of newcomers, more willing to judge people by their actions rather than appearances or circumstances. "Our child will grow up in a different world than we did," Elizabeth mused, watching the last light fade from the mountains. "A world where strength comes in many forms, where worth isn't measured by conformity." "Because of you," Everett said, his hand covering hers. "You arrived wearing a wedding dress, facing mockery, yet stood tall. You turned judgment into respect, convenience into love, and a house into a home." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of the frightened but determined woman who had stepped off that train. "Not just because of me. Because we recognized in each other something worth fighting for." As night settled over the ranch, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her here, not just the physical distance from St. Louis to Willow Creek, but the emotional distance from desperate mail-order bride to confident rancher's wife, soon-to-be mother, and respected community member. Her story had become something of a legend in these parts, whispered to new arrivals, shared over quilting frames, told to young girls as evidence that a woman's worth extended far beyond beauty or conformity. It was a story not of fairy tale romance but of courage, resilience, and the power of defining oneself regardless of others' expectations. If Elizabeth's journey has inspired you today, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more stories that remind us all of our capacity for transformation. Remember, true strength isn't about never falling, it's about rising every time life knocks you down.